Peter Andreas here from the Watson Institute in the Department of Political Science at Brown University. It's my pleasure to welcome you to another Security Seminar Series event, this time co-sponsored with Hillel, thanks to Marshall Hainhorn there at Hillel. It's my great pleasure to welcome back to Brown again Tim Snyder, an old friend actually. It seems that we have him here at least once a year, often for a new book. He's so prolific that we can have a new book for him every year. Tim Snyder's, I would spend much of the seminar going through his bio, and you want to hear from him, not from me, but just a few highlights. But I will start with what I think is most important, which is Tim is a Brown grad, and not mentioned in his bio is I think he was the first editor of the Brown Journal of World Affairs, or one of the first editors of the Brown Journal of World Affairs. Also buried in his bio is one of his most important books, least recognized as an edited volume with myself and Tim, called The Wall Around the West, which has a title that is interestingly relevant for today: State Borders and Immigration Controls in North America and Europe. We did that when we had postdocs together almost 2 decades ago up the street in Cambridge. Tim, since then, actually then as well, but since then, he specializes in depressing books, but he does them very well. I'd say, I don't know which is more depressing, to be perfectly honest, this one or his last book, which was equally successful, best-selling books. This one is Black Earth, The Holocaust as History and Warning, and what is, from my perspective, I mean, most distinctive about this book is that although Tim is a historian, he's also a historian of the present, including the present moment, and maybe even we could say a historian of the future. And so today's talk, perhaps more relevant than we ever thought, Tim will also add some comments about the current historical moment. So Tim Snyder from Yale University, Black Earth, The Holocaust as History and Warning. It's out in paperback actually a couple months ago, and we will have a book signing and reception immediately after the talk. So help me welcome Tim back to Brown.
Thank you very much, Peter. No matter how many times I come back here, I never get over the feeling of debt to this place. As Peter mentioned, I was a 91 grad of Brown. I majored in history and political science, and I had the wonderful good fortune to study with an amazing history department here. I certainly didn't appreciate it at the time, because when you're 19, you don't appreciate anything properly. But I am glad and gratified that I have the chance to come back every now and again and express that gratitude and remember. I want to start in a way with that historical moment, with that precise historical moment, 1989. That's when I was in the middle of my studies at Brown, when the revolutions in Eastern Europe took place. 1991, when I graduated from Brown, when the Soviet Union came apart. Because the way I want to introduce this talk, the way I want to get into my argument about what caused the Holocaust, is by asking a bigger question about how we think about history, how we think about time, how we think about causality. It seems to me that really to make a case for the importance of the Holocaust, this is going to seem strange, but to make a case for the importance of the Holocaust, one has to first make a case for the importance of history as such. When I look out at the landscape of memory in our country and in Europe and elsewhere in the world, it's certainly true that the Holocaust is above the surface. People see it. There's a claim that we remember it. But I think it's very hard for one event to rescue history as such. And indeed, I worry when we put so much weight on an event, often without context or without an attempt to interpret or without causality, we're actually overlooking a deeper problem, which is that we've lost a sense of historical time and even what history means. All right, that's a big claim, and I'm going to try to defend it in about 5 or 6 minutes. So if you think back Those of you who can, I see young people here. Thank you for coming. If you think about that moment, 1989, 89, 90, 91, this is the moment of what I would call the beginning of the politics of inevitability. The sense that history had worn itself out, or as some of the Hegelians of the time said, worked itself out. If there was a text which, an intelligent text, a text from the American intelligentsia which hovered over that moment, it would have been Francis Fukuyama's text article about the end of history, which, let's be fair, had a question mark at the end of it. I remember this text very well. I remember reading it with great excitement, the idea that somehow we'd reached the end of something and that therefore all the wonderful intellectual history I'd studied would be sufficient because there would be no more new ideas, right? 3 semesters with Professor Gluck and we were done because there would be no more ideas ever. Liberal democracy was the last idea. But I also remember very clearly speaking to my TA, Mary Lou Roberts, who has gone on to have a very significant, indeed formidable career as a historian, since telling me that in her mind, Fukuyama's article was sophomoric. That word somehow stayed with me because I was at the time a sophomore, but that it was sophomoric, right? That this was preschool Hegelianism. This was a fundamental misunderstanding. What kind of idea was it, though? What kind of Hegelianism was this? It was the notion that history had finished and that insofar as there were facts out there, they could all be gathered into one story, right? Whatever seemed to be happening, it was all working its way out towards liberal democracy just because there was no alternative, right? And I would say that notion of no alternative, the Germans have a nice word for this like they do for everything, Alternativlosigkeit. The idea that there's no alternative is the big idea of our time, or was until very recently. It takes different forms. Some people call it neoliberalism. Some people call it the lack of alternatives. I'm calling it here the politics of inevitability. The idea that history, whatever it seems to be doing, is moving forward towards things. Bombs may go off, right? Wars may happen. Financial crises may come. But basically, history is moving forward in a certain direction. We understand what it is. This is the politics of inevitability. Now, what is the problem with this? I'm sure you can give me a list of many, many problems. But one of the problems with this way of seeing time, right? Because I'm just talking about time. I'm trying to build out a little space where we can talk about history. And in order to do that, I think we have to first talk about time and how we feel about time. The problem with this way of seeing time is that it's really vulnerable to the notion of emergency, right? Because sometimes things happen that are so dramatic that you can't quite immediately figure out how they are helping us move towards liberal democracy, right? Like, for example, when 2 big buildings are knocked down in New York. It's not easy at first glance to explain how that is moving us closer to liberal democracy. Or when there's a financial crisis, as there was in 2008. It's not easy to work that into a story of how everything is moving towards liberal democracy. And so what do you then do? You fall into a panic, you talk about, and you use the word emergency, or you use the word exceptional, right? And you talk about how things are unprecedented, how nothing like this has ever happened before. And of course, in a trivial sense, it's true. Nothing like anything has ever happened before, right? Everything's new. It's wonderful, right? But in a profound sense, the reason you say that nothing like this has ever happened before is because you've already moved history completely out of the picture. Right? When you're in the politics of inevitability, when the only thing that matters is our march towards something, let's say liberal democracy, then you've already given yourself a license to forget about history entirely. And so, for example, although the attacks of 9/11 really were similar to a whole lot of things which had happened in the past, we went for the idea that this was an emergency, this was an exception, therefore we should do exceptional things. Okay, now. Now, what's the alternative, or what's the darker alternative to the politics of inevitability? What's an alternative way of seeing time that we may be tempted towards, which I suspect you in various ways are feeling, although you may not use the same words. There's an alternative way of thinking about this, which is what I would call the politics of eternity. Okay, that may seem even more obscure. What do I mean by eternity? Okay, well, ironically, at the exact moment when Frank Fukuyama was publishing his arresting piece about the end of history, right? At that exact moment, another Hegelian was being revived in Russia, a man called Ivan Ilyin, who I spoke about at length the last time he was here. Another Hegelian, another person who had an idea of how of how the past becomes the present. But his conclusions were very different. What Ilin said, and this, I mention him just because he's a nice alternative, but also because he's another Hegelian, and also because he's the most important political thinker in Russia and arguably in the entire West right now. What's interesting about his view of the past is that he sees things in exactly the opposite way. It's not that history has worked itself out. It's not that all the facts can be gathered into a story about how we're moving towards liberal democracy. On the contrary, in his view, history never started. God tried to create the world and failed. We're surrounded by fragments which are in a meaningless arrangement. There is really no truth since God started to create the world. All we have are these meaningless encounters with pseudo-reality. We know nothing for sure. In fact, there is no truth in this world at all. Right, a kind of startlingly, we might say, postmodern or post-factual way of seeing things. There's no truth in this world at all, right? All we have are fragments. All we have is meaninglessness. And from this, he draws a couple of conclusions. The first is that a leader, when a leader comes, will come from outside history, right? Riding on that sort of metaphorical or metaphysical white horse from, I mean, the fascists really did like white horses, rather a lot, white horses. So riding on that metaphysical white horse from outside history, a leader with a capital L is going to come. He's going to rescue a virtuous nation, right? No nation seems virtuous, but our nation, or Russia for Ilin, our nation actually, underneath the incrustation of the irrelevant facts, is deeply virtuous, right? So, for example, we may be, overweight men wearing Velcro camouflage suits, but at a rally, we can imagine that we are a special nation. There's going to be more about the present by the time we get to the end, right? So we can imagine that underneath all of this, there is some kind of deep metaphysical virtue which the leader is going to bring about. Now, in this way of seeing the past, or of seeing time, everything is flat. Nothing ever really happens. There's just the virtuous self. There's just almost the virginal self, which is under constant attack from the outside by the forces which don't understand its virtue, right? For Ilin, this means Russian virtue, but this kind of idea can function in pretty much any context. And this idea also cancels out history in a different way. It turns time into this totally flat horizon, where everything which happens in the past is just a kind of monument which sticks up above the horizon. It's neither it's not close, it's not far, it's always in the middle distance. And everything which happens in the past reminds us of how we were virtuous and how others were trying to attack us. There's a kind of regularity in attempts at penetration of the virtuous self, but that's pretty much it. Okay, these are two ways of experiencing time. Right? I think, and I may just be, I may be way off the end of my branch already at this point, but I think we're hovering between them right now. I think in the United States of America and more broadly in the West, we're hovering in between these 2 points, these two ways of experiencing time right now. I think we're at that thing which is called a turning point, okay? But here's the funny thing about turning points. Like when you're at a turning point, you're not actually moving, right? I mean, you're not going anywhere. You're just turning, right? You're just kind of standing. It gives you a chance to look around at the alternatives, to think for a moment. So what I want to try to do is to take this moment, take this turning point, which I think we're at, and use it as a way to think about how we might engage with history to understand where we are now. Now, why do I think an exercise like that might be useful? Well, these notions which I'm tossing around, politics of inevitability, politics of eternity, although these are my words, this is not a new conflict, right? The liberal order has been imperiled before. A global order based on rules has fallen apart before. People who are convinced that there was progress and that there were rules have lost that confidence before. People who believed that history was moving forward have been broken and decided instead that history was flat, that time was flat. That's already happened once. It happened between about 1912 and 1933. It happened during the end of the first globalization. This was, and now I'm not joking at all, one of the main topics of Professor Gluck's lecture course. What happens when liberalism, when the confidence of liberalism, when the sense of time of liberalism, this thing I'm calling the politics of inevitability, what happens when that breaks, right? What happens when that breaks? Now, what I'm going to try to do here is assert that history is useful right now in this turning point where we are, because history helps us to think about time. It gives us a certain amount of self-consciousness about time, and therefore may give us a better sense of our own agency in time. Okay, so what's the historical argument? And what is it, and what does it have to do with the Holocaust? Because after all, what I'm doing now is I'm introducing a lecture and a book which is about the Holocaust. I'm trying to do this in a very different way, right? Because the easy thing to say about the Holocaust, and I know it's easy because I've said it a number of times myself, right? The easy thing to do about with the Holocaust is to say, this provides some lessons. And it certainly does, right? If you see a swastika, you should get rid of that swastika, right? It certainly does provide some lessons. There are some things we can learn in a fairly simple way. What I want to do, though, here is make a slightly more ambitious claim, a slightly more ambitious argument, namely that the Holocaust shows what happens when a certain kind of idea of time triumphs over another kind of idea of time. Okay, that's too abstract. Let me try to be more specific. My argument about the Holocaust in this book has three parts. The three parts are, the three causes are ecological panic, the sense that the world is nothing but a finite collection of resources for which we must struggle as quickly as possible. The second causal argument is the destruction of the state, that the Holocaust and episodes of mass murder in general are possible when states are destroyed. And the third causal argument has to do with globalization, that the way that globalization is processed, the ideas of globalization, can tilt us towards or away believing in panic, can tilt us towards or away supporting structures or destroying them. Okay, that's enough abstraction. Let me try now to be concrete. Let me start a historical argument now with a particular person and see how a particular person and her experiences might lead us towards the claims that I'm trying to make. The person who I want to talk about, who figures in the book, is Irena Lipschitz. Irena was a young woman, older than the students here, but younger than the sort of median here, I would say. Irena Lipschitz was a young woman, a Polish-speaking Jew from Warsaw. In September of 1939, when the German army invaded Poland from the west, she, like about 250,000 other Polish Jews, fled to the east. On 17 September 1939, the Soviet Union then invaded Poland from the east, meaning that Irena, all of those Jewish refugees, and all of the native Jews and all of the native other Polish citizens of Eastern Poland were now under Soviet rule, right? Irena was welcomed by a local Jewish community in a town very near the Polesian marshes called Wysock. She stayed with local Jews. She made friends. Then in September of 1941, in June of 1941, almost 2 years after she had fled there, the German army then invaded the Soviet Union. And this is where our sense of geography goes all awry, because we're not used to thinking about Eastern Europe, we're not used to thinking about the Soviet Union, and above all, we're not used to thinking about how the Second World War really begins in Eastern Europe, which is with a double German invasion. First, one half of Poland, then the other half of Poland, but the other half of Poland has already been invaded by the Soviet Union, right? That's Irena's experience. So German power comes, displaces Soviet power. About a year after that, in September of 1942, Irena, along with the local Jews, along with the other refugees, is gathered up by the Germans and local people to be shot over a pit. She runs away into the marshes. She's a city girl. She's not the kind of person who's really fit to live in marshes. I don't think many of us here really are. You know, raise your hands if you want to give it a shot. After 2 or 3 days, she realizes that a life on mushrooms and berries probably isn't going to work out, and she takes the existential decision, really, that she's going to stand on the side of the road and just raise her hand and ask the first person who comes by for help. So she does that. She sees someone emerge over the horizon. As he comes closer, she sees it's a youngish man, broad-shouldered, unshaven, carrying a double-barreled shotgun over his shoulder. She asks him for help. Okay. Now, this is a story about the Holocaust. This is a story about the Holocaust. And although it may not sound typical, it's actually right down the middle of how the Holocaust actually happens. The place where Irena is the Polesian marshes, right, of which no one has ever heard, is the first place where the Germans shot women and children in large numbers. The way that people were being killed, being shot over pits, was how half the victims of the Holocaust died. It was also how the Holocaust started. So in that sense, it's much more important than the gas chambers, which came later. Irena was a Polish Jew. Most of the people who died in the Holocaust were Polish Jews. Her fate was tied to the fate of Soviet Jews. That is the other large victim group in the Holocaust, right? So everything about this is actually typical. But it doesn't seem typical to us because it escapes or it defies the timelines that we associate with the Holocaust. The ways that we explain the Holocaust by not explaining it, but by putting it on certain timelines, certain automaticities. What do I mean? Well, the nation, right? I mean, surely the Holocaust was about the German nation and its, whatever, its anti-Semitism or something, its orderliness. Surely it was about, if it wasn't about them, then it must have been about the Ukrainian anti-Semites, the Belarusian anti-Semites, the Polish anti-Semites. It must be about the nation somehow. But where Irena is, right, what is she? She is a Jew, an assimilated rather, Jew in Poland who speaks Polish, who's moved to, among other Jews who speak Yiddish, who are in a village which is surrounded by people who speak a mixture of Belarusian and Ukrainian, in a part of Europe where the majority of the population does not define itself nationally, who in the period of a very few months is under Polish rule, Soviet rule, and then German rule, right? And she's in the middle of the swamp. Are we really going to explain all of this by nationality? And what about the machine, right? Where's Auschwitz in all of this? It's nowhere. Auschwitz isn't a major killing facility yet. It's not going to be until the end of the Holocaust. Where is this metaphor of a machine? Where does that lead us? It doesn't lead us anywhere. The Holocaust has already started. By the time Irena is rounded up in September of 1942, we're moving towards 2 million Jews who have already been shot, right? 2 million Jews have already been shot, and yet Auschwitz is not in the picture. So the story of administration and efficiency, and enlightenment, right? Logic, how the history of the Holocaust is a history of the extrusion of emotion and the insert in reason, some logical outcome of the Enlightenment, right? This very popular story associated with Zygmunt Bauman. Where is that? I can't find it in these marshes, and I think that's because it's not there. And what about the German state? Right, when she's looking for mushrooms, and the contact she makes is with this local man with a shotgun. Where is the German state? How is the German state exactly bringing about the Holocaust, which is taking place before Irena's eyes? It is, no doubt, but not in a very straightforward way. And the case that I want to make is that it's precisely this kind of scene which is typical. Not the scene of German bureaucracy taking rights away, putting people in concentration camps and then killing them, which is not at all, in fact, how the Holocaust happened. But this scene of chaos is typical in two important ways. The first way is our own scholarship. Our own scholarship about how mass killing happens. What does our own scholarship about mass killing actually say? If we take a step back from the Holocaust, if we imagine that it's part of history and not just an element in these stories about how things must happen, what does our own scholarship about the Holocaust say? About mass killing say? It says, right, Peter Andreas has worked on neighboring questions, it says that mass killing, ethnic cleansing, is associated not so much with a strong state, but with a failing state, right, with state collapse. That's the strongest association, so say the social scientists. What do the historians say? The historians say we know exceptions because that's our bread and butter. We always know exceptions. The political scientists may have big N studies. They may have studies of those big N studies. They may have critical literatures about those studies of big N studies. But we know a couple of exceptions, and that's how we make, that's how we make our living. What are the exceptions that we know? Cambodia, People's Republic of China, Soviet Union. These are the states which managed to kill large numbers of people without falling apart. What is the rule in those exceptions? Those are all party states. Those are all places where the most important relationship between the citizen and the polity is not with the state, but with the party. Why am I stressing this? Because that helps us to see what is so, in a way, predictable and so normal about Nazi Germany. Not normal in the sense that it happens every day, but normal in the sense that it actually corresponds to exactly what our scholarship says. We have two bodies of scholarship. One says mass killing happens in conditions of political chaos. Another says party states are capable of killing people in large numbers. What is Nazi Germany? It's the one historical case of a party state which deliberately destroys other states, and in doing so, creates a zone where mass killing is possible. Almost all of the mass killing of Nazi Germany will take place in zones of deliberately manufactured anarchy, and that mass killing includes the entirety of the Holocaust. So Irene's position in a marsh, right, looking for mushrooms and berries, is actually what we should expect to see because it's normal. That is how this event unfolded. Why else should we expect it to be normal? Why else should we expect to see this? Ideology, okay? Ideology. Now I'm going to try to move closer to these ideas of eternity and so on that I was raising before. Ideology. The person in European intellectual life who would have said that a Jew struggling for existence and failing and ending up face to face with someone with a gun, someone with overpowering force, right? The person in European intellectual life who would have said that was normal was precisely Adolf Hitler. That is Adolf Hitler's idea. That is chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Mein Kampf. That is Adolf Hitler's description of the world. The world is nothing but racial struggle. If you think it's something besides racial struggle, that is because a Jew has put ideas in your head, whether they're Christian ideas, communist ideas, capitalist ideas, constitutionalist ideas, it doesn't matter. They're all fundamentally Jewish. And those ideas create the impression in your mind that there's something like history. But there isn't really, says Hitler. All you have are biological regularities. The biological regularity of the races being threatened from the outside by Jews. And so, therefore, the world can be restored, the normal rhythm, the normal regularity of the world can be restored if Jews can be removed from the planet. The very felicitous title of my colleague Alan Confino's book is A World Without Jews, and that is in fact what Hitler is imagining. Now, this ideology is also a politics. It's a It's a vision without time. You see, it's a vision of eternity. It's perhaps not particularly glorious. It's an eternity, of animals and plants and biology, right? But it's still an eternity. There's no time. Nothing ever moves forward. Everything is always the same. Race struggles against race. The stronger wins. That's all we need to know about the past, the present, and the future, says Hitler. These regularities, says Hitler, on page 1 of Mein Kampf, are like the laws of physics. They just work this way. This is all we really need to know. But this is, of course, also a politics. It is a response to globalization. It's a claim that all the various rules that might constrain Germany, right? Again, whether they're Christian rules or capitalist rules or an idea of working class solidarity, those things which seem to be general rules, to be universal, are actually external impositions. They're artificial, they have to be gotten rid of so that Germany can just take everything that it needs, so that Germany can seek what Hitler calls Lebensraum. Now, the vision of Lebensraum has two sides, each of which is political. One side of Lebensraum is the idea that we are in fact, as Hitler says, like, I can never remember whether it's finches or finks, but like an animal, okay? We're like animals. It's my German translator corrected me. I said finch and it was fink, or I said fink and it was finch. I can't remember for the life of me which one it was. But the point is that we are like animals. We're like reptiles. We're like insects, right? And we just struggle for Lebensraum. We just struggle for ecological niches. That's what we do. And if we don't, we're starved out. That's so existential politics. And if you don't think that kind of thing is motivational, right, you just have not been paying attention. But the second kind of politics of Lebensraum, which is even more relevant to the present moment, is the idea of lifestyle, okay? Hitler says we need to have this is more or less word for word, we need to have as much land as the Americans. Not to survive in a physical sense, but because our standard of living must be as high as the American standard of living. And what's standard of living? Standard of living is what people perceive it to be. It's all relative and it's all subjective. And therefore, we must continue to struggle and starve millions, tens of millions of other people in order to have the highest standard of living in the world, right? And so then if this notion that it's all right for people to die in some faraway country so that I can live well, right? I hope you see it. That's not so terribly far away from the way that much of our political thought or political non-thought happens now, right? So this notion brings us, very close to a swamp in 1942. But what does it tell us about Germany? Okay, because of course, Germany is important, and if we're going to contemplate what Germany or what the National Socialism or the Holocaust teaches us now, we have to think about Germany in the 1930s. How do we think about Germany in the 1930s if we're thinking in these broad concepts of time and panic and the state and the destruction of the state? Surely Hitler didn't destroy the German state. No, he didn't. But he transformed it, right? He transformed it by way of these ideas. When you think of Jews being singled out in Germany for discrimination, yes, they were singled out for discrimination. But how in particular? By being associated with Weltjudentum, by being associated with an imaginary notion of world Jewry. They were extruded from citizenship, right? I mean, also legally, but above all, mentally, spiritually, symbolically. They were extruded from the body of citizens and put into this global metaphor of Jews. They were taken out, right? They were taken out of the from among their fellow citizens and put somewhere else. They were put into a story of how the world was working against Germany. All of the measures of discrimination against Jews, which I'm sure can all recite, right? The boycotts, the Nuremberg laws, the expropriation, that was all accompanied by this rhetoric, right? And also by a very specific sociology. So, for example, and this is an example which always stays with me because I have small children and I know what it's, if a Jewish family can't put its child in a school anymore, how do the neighbors react? They put their child in. They don't leave that space open. That's just the way it happens. And when you take something in that way, then you're much more likely to go along with the story of why this was necessary, right? And that sociological logic functions at higher and higher and higher levels all the way through to murder. Okay, how else is the system transformed? It's transformed by way of an institution which is anti-state. And again, I realize I'm fighting hard against our stereotypes of like the Germans as orderly and the Germans as loving the state and the Germans as rule-bound and so on and so forth. And of course, my claim is that that's one more set of ethnic stereotypes which cannot help us understand, which almost by their nature must be wrong. What is the SS? When you think of the SS, you're probably thinking of like shiny boots and a clean uniform. You're thinking about policemen, but they were not actually policemen. They were people who worked for a party organization, what we would call a non-governmental organization. They were beyond the state. They were animated by an ideology which was anti-political. They were animated by the ideology which I've just described, that is that the world really is composed of nothing but racial struggle. Where can they act inside Germany? Pretty much nowhere. Right? The SS in the 1930s has a relatively small impact on German life, again, compared to what happens later. Where do they actually rule in Germany? Where do they have total power in Germany? In the camps. What's a camp? A camp is a zone where the law doesn't function. It's a stateless zone. In interwar Germany, in Germany of the 1930s, it's a small pocket of lawlessness, of statelessness, of anarchy, which is engineered for the SS. That is their function in the 1930s. They run the camps. Why is that so important? Not because the camps lead directly to the Holocaust, because they don't, but because the camps are a small laboratory for a much greater policy or a much greater experiment of destroying the state beyond the boundaries of Germany. Now, here the book does something which I can't really allow myself to do, which is that it proceeds from beyond Germany to Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, the Soviet Union, and tells the history of 1938 to 1941 as a history of progressively radical state destruction. It makes the point that the Holocaust did not happen in Germany in the 1930s and could not have happened in Germany in the 1930s. That the events that we know as the Holocaust could only unfold once a very special kind of German power went beyond the boundaries of pre-war Germany and destroyed other kinds of states, right? Whether that's Austria, where, what happens in Austria, right? So we have a mental habit. We say, the Austrians are worse anti-Semites than the Germans. But who knows, really, right? Why do we think that? We think that because in the spring of 1938, there were more atrocities committed against Austrian Jews in a few weeks than there had been in Germany in a few years, even though it was Nazi Germany, right? So what do? We say, well, the Austrians must be worse anti-Semites. Is that really it? Or is it perhaps the fact that the Austrian state ceased to exist from one day to the next, and that created a very special kind of politics where one part of the citizenry was very keen to associate another part of the citizenry with a state that was ceasing to exist, and where one part of the citizenry, the ones that could identify with Nazi Germany, I don't mean this personally, but you get the point, that could identify with Nazi Germany because they weren't Jewish, knew what was coming and could associate this part of the citizenry with the old regime, the regime that was going away. And what if that politics only becomes more radical, right? If you think of Vienna at all, or Austria at all, or Czechoslovakia at all, or Poland at all, it's probably nationally, right? The symbols are Munich, or Anschluss, or the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But what the destruction of these states meant for the history of the Holocaust has to do above all to what happens to their citizens. The citizens of Austria, the Jewish ones, cease to be citizens of anything, and then things are possible that literally were not possible the day before. The citizens of Czechoslovakia, the Jewish citizens of Czechoslovakia, when Czechoslovakia ceases to exist, they lose their citizenship. And then some of them in Slovakia in newly independent Slovakia, become second-class citizens, and among them are the first people sent to Auschwitz. Some of them in the far east of Czechoslovakia, Subcarpathian Ruthenia, lose their citizenship entirely and end up, in a long series of events, being the first victims of mass shootings in the history of the Holocaust, and indeed in the history of the world. The story begins with the destruction of Czechoslovakia. When we move into Poland and into the Soviet Union, we're now moving into zones where Germany intended to colonize, where Germany believed that the people in question, the majority populations, were racially inferior, where the whole idea was an idea of creating an exploitative empire, and where ex ante, the Germans said, not only are these places not states, they were never states. These people were never citizens of anything. We're not actually invading a country. There's no country here. It's not an occupation, say the Nazi lawyers, because an occupation requires the prior existence of a polity. And there is no polity here. We're just moving into this uncharted territory inhabited by various natives, right? So no one has any sort of rights. Now, this means that, and so of course this means the place that Irena lives or tries to escape is precisely typical. And her fate is also typical. We don't hear much from the German Jews who die, right? We hear from the German Jews who live, Viktor Klemperer, for example, right? But why not the German Jews who die? Where do they die? They don't die in Germany, right? They don't. They can't be killed in Germany. They're sent to places like Mali Trostinets, or Riga, or the Łódź ghetto. Why? Because in those zones of anarchy, they can be killed. Their death in that sense becomes typical, because their death is like the death of the Polish and the Soviet Jews who were killed very close to the places where they actually live, right? So now, where does this lead us? How should we be thinking about this as we try to move back to the concepts that I started with about how we think about time, how we think about the present, how we think about a historical moment, how we think about the 1930s. I mean, just to make one point very clear before I move on, what I'm describing is the whole Holocaust, okay? There are details like France, right? There are details like Italy. There are details like the Netherlands and Norway, and I'm happy to discuss them all. All of them fall into this basic logic of the state and statelessness. But insofar as Jews are going to be killed, they're going to lose their connection with the state, and they're going to be physically moved into a zone of statelessness. That's the whole Holocaust. There is no other Holocaust besides the one that I'm describing. The data that reaches us of the survivors, of the trains and so on, that's exceptional. It's filtered out precisely by survival, right? And the reasons why people survive have something to do almost always with the state. What I'm describing to you is the Holocaust, I think, as a historian, or at least as an international historian would see it. Okay. What can this tell us then about this thing that I've been calling the politics of eternity? Can we make this very, I know, abstract concept somehow land on the events that I'm describing? Well, first, think about Hitler, right? The ideology that I described to you is an ideology of eternity. It's about the way things always are. When Hitler talked about a 1,000-year Reich, it wasn't that he meant a specific 1,000 years, right? He was using round numbers the way that we use round numbers in order not to think about time, right? When we say, like, when there's a war in Ukraine in 2014 and we think 100 years ago there was the First World War, therefore this is like that. That's a way of not thinking with time, right? Using round numbers is a way of not thinking historically. It's a way of imagining eternity, cycles, regularities, a 1,000-year Reich. So if you say, well, the 1,000-year Reich, it only lasted for whatever it would be. It only lasted for 12 and a half years. Ha ha, you're missing the point. Because while it lasted, it was a 1,000-year Reich, right? While it lasted, it was all about eternity. When the German army marches into the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, they're not all thinking about eternity and regularities. But as they start to lose, and as they're ordered to live from the land, they do start to think about survival and calories, right? And the struggle of one race against the other. When the SS moves into Eastern Europe, it's thinking about eternity one way. It's thinking about this Lebensraum, which is going to reestablish the normal rules of life on the planet. This Lebensraum where the master race is going to command and rule forever. But very quickly, they start thinking about eternity in a different way. Again, in terms of calories, as they manage the ghettos, as they starve who they think needs to be starved, as they make the decisions that the Jews, for example, in the summer of 1942, spring of 1942, the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto, Elena Lipschitz's relatives, that these people should be gassed to death rather than worked to death because we don't have the calories for them, right? That's 1942. Or in 1942, when those Jews are taken from the ghetto to the trains, how are they brought there? At the beginning, they're promised bread and jam. They're promised bread and jam because in their world had been reduced to these regularities of eating, of survival, of trying to get to the next day. That's unimaginable, isn't it, right? Bread and jam brings you to Umschlagplatz, brings you to Treblinka. But that's how it happened, right, in the beginning. Or 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Jürgen Stroop is putting down the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, one of the bloodiest atrocities imaginable. Asked later about why he was there and what he thought he was doing, what does he say? He says, I was fighting for the milk and honey of Ukraine, right? That's how he sees it all. It's a struggle for eternity. It's a struggle for prosperity, so these facts, right? The fact that you're actually taking Jewish children out of basements and shooting them or burning them, right? That fact is lost in this general view that we're going to master. We're going to master an empire and things are going to change forever. They're going to change forever for us. This logic, the way that time breaks, the way that everything flattens out, you can see it at almost every level. You know, when we move down to less dramatic perpetrators, like the Polish police, does their sense of time make any sense? Up until 1939, Polish policemen were standing in the corners of Jewish markets preventing pogroms. In 1942, they're on the outside of the Jewish ghetto, helping to make sure the deportations to Treblinka take place. How? Why? Because the state has been destroyed, and people who performed one function in one set of institutions perform another function in a set of other institutions. If you want to say, no, wait, they're all anti-Semites, then think about the Judenrat. The Judenrat undergoes exactly the same kind of evolution. In 1939, the Jewish men, the elders of the cities and towns of Poland, were in charge of local communal autonomy. Kosher, right, ritual slaughter, taking money from abroad, marriages, funerals, right? All of that was regulated in the arrangement with the Central Polish State. When the Central Polish State is destroyed and German authority comes in, those same men, and it is usually those same men, then form this thing that we call the Judenrat. And the men who were in charge of weddings in 1939 are the same men who are making the decisions about who's going to be deported first in 1942. Is it because they changed? They did change, but that's not fundamentally what happened. What fundamentally would happen is that the state ceased to exist. Time no longer made sense. Think about the collaborators in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, right? Think about the fact that many of them, quite possibly most of them, were double collaborators, that they had first collaborated with the Soviet regime and then collaborated with the German occupiers. That's what I get for talking with my hands. Then collaborated with the German occupiers. Does that make any sense in any kind of story about time moving forward? It doesn't. It makes so little sense that books about the Holocaust do not capture it, cannot capture it. It's so much easier to say the Germans were going in a certain direction or the locals were all anti-Semitic. A lot of them were. That's fine. We can grant that. But the story of a Latvian policeman, for example, who earns his living as a Latvian policeman in the 30s, then becomes a communist, right, when the Soviets come and invade Latvia, and then becomes the commander of the bloodiest unit of murderers of Jews in the history of the Holocaust. That story does not make sense in time, right? It doesn't make sense in progression. It only makes sense with these powerful, powerful breaks. And one goes on and on. You can just keep going down and down and down. At every fractal level, it's like this. The rescuers. How can you rescue when all of the institutional structures, incentives are against you? In the land of statelessness, right? In Poland, the Soviet Union, the Baltic states, it's a crime to try to rescue. It's a crime punishable by death to aid a Jew. But how is that possible? Because there's no state. You're not a citizen. There's no institution protecting you. The incentive structure, therefore, is to turn in any Jew who asks you for help, having first taken his or her money, right? Which is how most people, but not everyone behaves. Okay, now, where does this bring us? It brings us to where I want to try to come to a close, which has to do with today. So first, let me try to sum up. There are three parts. There are three things happening. There's an idea about globalization, and the idea is this idea of eternity. Globalization is not really moving us forward. Globalization is an illusion. The rules are an illusion. They're there to be broken. The exception is the rule. Emergency is normal. Struggle is all that's real. Don't let anyone who tells you otherwise is a Jew, right? This is Hitler's idea. And once you break that down, you're moving towards, and this is the second idea, a notion of ecological panic. If the world is just there as a source of resources, right, as a limited supply of resources, and all these rules are lies meant to crush you and implicitly to starve you, then you should break them as soon as possible. You should take what you can in order to survive, but simultaneously in order to have the highest standard of living possible. How can any of this happen? This ideology can only be animated, and this panic can only be produced when a state is transformed on the basis of this ideology, and when that state then destroys other states, which in the specific example of the Holocaust is how the mass killing is demonstrated to be possible. Okay, now, let me then try to conclude with a brief word about today. I'm not going to say that what we have from here are lessons. I mean, I do actually think there are lessons from the past, and I've talked about them elsewhere. What I'm going to try to do instead is say that this notion of how something was possible, like this interpretation, might be more useful to us than just remembering, right? A causal interpretation which has pieces might help us to see patterns, right? If we can see what some of those pieces are, then we might be able to see them coming towards us now, right? So if I'm right, if I'm right about this historical moment, right? And you notice that all I'm doing is I'm trying to resuscitate a notion of a historical moment. By putting causality into the story, I'm making a moment, right? If there's no causality, it's just a flat memory, right? Or it's just an inevitable line of progression. If you talk about causes, then what you're trying to do is you're trying to create a moment. So if I'm right that in this moment there were basically three kinds of causes, this anti-global idea, this feeling of ecological panic, and then this fact of the destruction of states, where does that leave us? Well, it makes the history of mass killing since 1945 a lot clearer. All these events which seem exceptional, whether it's Rwanda or Sudan or Yugoslavia or Syria, they all make more sense under this analysis. I'm happy to talk about just why. We also have reasons to be worried about the present as we look at it now, right? China is a bit similar to Germany in the 1930s in that it's a growing export power which can't, by any stretch of the imagination, feed itself, and which has problems which Germany didn't have, like a shortage of water. We have reasons to be concerned, I think, especially in the present moment, with the collapse of states. When we look at Europe, we see the weakening of the European Union. That's what's on the surface. But those states have basically never existed. We can talk about this more, but those states have basically never existed except as empires or as elements of an integration process. It has never been there's never been a France. I realized, right? I got your attention finally. There's never been a France, right? There's been an empire, right, called France for a long time, and then as France lost its empire, it went into this integration process. That's European history right there. you lose your empire and you go into integration. The whole nation state business, right, is there for the children, right? It's there for it's nice for the children, but it never actually happened. So as we look for, if we look at perhaps the end of the European Union, we're looking at the risk of states. Do you really think that Great Britain can pull out of the European Union and still be Great Britain? Do you really think that France can pull out and still be France? I have my doubts. And even if they exist, it's not going to be the prosperity of the European Union just divided into pieces. It's going to be something very, very different. And of course, you know what I'm going to say next, which is that the populists who are now so important in Europe and in the United States have a notion of time which is basically flat. They're the ones who tell the children's fairy tale about how there was once a nation state and the nation state was great and all we have to do is get rid of the internet, the globalism and the European Union, right? And then everything will return to normal. That never happened, right? That is a vision of what's normal. It's not a reference to history at all, right? Okay, which brings me to the United States. In the United States, there are certain, I don't have to tell you, perhaps, like there's some things going on in the United States which are maybe not entirely, wünschenswert. So to be wished for, I meant, to be wished for, sorry. It's like falling into German is like a bad habit that we've got to stop, got to be stopped now. Okay, so the personalization of globalization, right? The idea that globalization has a face, that face is Jewish, or Mexican, or Chinese, or whatever it might be. The flattening out of time, right? The making America great again, with no notion of when again was, because there was never again. Again never happened, right? It's all a cycle, right? America was great when? At that mythical time when it wasn't affected by the outside world. When was that? Never, right? It's a regularity, right? It's not history, it's a regularity. Enthusiasm for the destruction of the state, right? A campaign and now a White House strategist whose basic idea of politics is that it shouldn't exist because the state shouldn't really exist. That seems like a strange idea. People aren't used to it, but it's definitely there. And of course, the generation of ecological panic, right, with by way of global warming. If we don't think that there is global warming, we make ecological panic more likely, partly because we make the disaster worse, but also partly when the country which is arguably the most important in the whole process says it's going to do nothing except make the problem worse, other people are going to panic. And it doesn't help in this connection that the region of the world that's most affected by global warming is largely inhabited by people who are Muslim. That doesn't help at all, right? It's a coincidence. It just happens to be the case, but it is the case. And so when then one thinks about south to north migration, both as a symbol and as a reality, right? So long as we're warming the planet, that's going to keep coming, both in Europe and in the United States, right? So these things, unfortunately, are all connected in a kind of complex. Okay, the very last word, and this is the part where I try to say that this is not all hopeless. So I need some nodding now, right? Thank you. What then? So then, what can be done? I mean, does it actually help to try to create the 1930s and 1940s as a moment, right? Can creating the 1930s and 1940s as a moment, as a horrible moment, but as a moment, can that somehow be useful? Let me try to claim that it can by returning to the story of Irena Lipschitz. So Irena, remember, city girl, Polish Jew, standing by a track in the swamp, puts out her hand. The man appears over the horizon, double-barreled shotgun over his shoulder. She looks him in the eye and asks for help. And without batting an eye, these are her words, without batting an eye, he agrees. And he digs her a shelter, and he feeds her for several months, and she's going to survive the Holocaust, and she's going to give us the words to this story. Now, what I find most interesting about her testimony, which she left right after the Second World War, is that she doesn't give the man's name. Why do I find that so interesting or so touching or so intellectually important? Because here's why. When we end the history of the Holocaust with rescue, which we almost always do, especially cinematically or in memoirs, right? We almost always end it with rescue. That rescuer somehow redeems, right? He redeems the Polish nation, or redeems the Belarusian nation, or the Russian nation, or the German. He somehow redeems, right? Or he redeems all of us because we imagine that we would have acted the way he or she did, right? That's the literary moment. She doesn't give us his name. he probably didn't belong to any nation or thought that he did. And by not giving us the name, she suspends something. She makes it harder for us to just to fasten on that as the ending of a story. And of course, my point here is that there isn't actually any redemption possible. Now, why is that important, and how could that be hopeful? I know I'm digging myself in deeper and deeper, but I'm going to try to come out. How could that possibly be a hopeful thing to say, or a useful thing to say? Well, for this reason. Think about where the culture is now. In our popular culture, right? And I'm looking at you gamers, right? In our popular culture, we flip from normal to post-catastrophic, right? Everything that happens in films and in games, right, is always after the catastrophe. It is in this precise world that I'm describing. There is no state. Everybody's competing for resources, right? That's the plot. That's the background to the plot. Whether you're like, have your hands, you know, on the seat next to you at a movie theater, or whether you have your hands around a joystick or whatever they're called now, that's the plot. That's what's assumed. There's no state, and we're all just struggling for resources, right? We flipped to post-catastrophic, right? In the popular culture. What I'm trying to claim here is that this is the wrong way to think about rescue, right? Because we don't know his name, and because we don't know his name, we can think about whether we would actually be like that. And the short answer is we wouldn't, right? Okay, again, I realize I'm digging myself deeper and deeper, but this is going to turn around. It's going to turn around. We wouldn't behave like that. We wouldn't rescue, right? He was a smuggler. He was a moonshiner. He was an anarchist. Certain eyes light up. He was an anarchist. Under Poland, he rescued communists because the Communist Party was illegal in Poland. When the Soviets came, he rescued Polish bureaucrats because the Soviets were deporting them. And when the Germans came, he rescued Jews. And for him, it was all the same. It was a kind of defiance, right? I've got a friend who's a moral philosopher who read my book in draft. And when he got to this part about this rescuer, you know, the moonshiner, the smuggler, the defiance of everyone, he said, he wrote on the margin, right? Most of his corrections were just like grammatical, but he wrote on the margin here, I want to party with this guy, right? And you know, the thing is, wouldn't we all, right? But we wouldn't be that guy. We wouldn't actually be that guy. People who like that, who rescued when there was no infrastructure around, were very, very rare. And so what I want to say about this is that the way to think about rescue has to be to try to prevent us from getting to that last moment, right? That moment where there's no state, that moment where it's all a struggle for resources, right? The way we tend to think about rescue is, let's wait, and this is very American, like this sort of American-style procrastination. Let's wait until like the last moment, and then, you know, somebody will come riding, right? Someone will come riding out of history and save us. We'll come riding out of history and save ourselves. But I think really the point has to be that we have to create the history. We have to create the time. We have to produce the time. If you let it get to the last minute, it's already too late. The moment that rescue in the sense of the one person rescuing another is the operative notion, it's already far too late, right? And so therefore rescue politically has to mean something like knowing what the causes are, right? Hence the usefulness of a historical moment, trying to head off some of those causes by knowing what the ideology is, which we're pretty good at, caring about structure and about ecological panic, which maybe we're not so good at. Trying to think in terms of, you know, our own moment, not just as a turning point, but as a moment where we have a certain amount of room for maneuver still. So this is where I want to end up. The mistake that people made, right, when I was a student here, not anybody I knew personally, of course, or any of my teachers, but the mistake that people made when I was a student here was to think we are entering an age of inevitability. We know how things are going to go. The place that I think we're now slipping to now is where you go when the inevitability, whatever you want to call it, liberal order, globalization, progress, enlightenment, the place where you slip when you don't believe in that is flat fascist time, the politics of eternity, right, the sense of one's own virtue. We're slipping towards that, I think. And what I think history can do, even the darkest history, in fact, maybe only the darkest history, what history can do is create a sense of a moment where, with a certain amount of self-consciousness about causality, then we think, and we're right to think, that we have a certain amount of agency. That is, we can think, when we know about another moment, we have the ability to think about the small things that we might be able to do in our own moment, but also to produce our own moment, to create a sense that we have some time. Thanks. Yeah, I was going to say, like, this is like, usually we have questions and answers, but those were all of my ideas, right? I don't have that was it. So you've been warned. If you wouldn't mind just telling me who you are, because I know some of you, but I don't know all of you.
My name is Andy Algava, and I have a history. I relate to your last point here and can attest to it. We think of these moments that there's time. Out of my background, I've attempted to make a difference in the politics. I lived in Salonika, Greece. My family was survivors in hiding. 50,000 Jews in Salonika were exterminated, and out of the 50,000 Jews, we were one of 3 families that were in hiding, thanks to courageous Greeks, and survived to liberation. And so that's been my heritage and my story. And your talk is very interesting to me because it creates a context of, let's say, my level 1 experience at the level of day to day. I was 3, 4 years old. I had no memory before I was 7, when my parents told me what all happened. It's like sensitive to that history where the Nazis invaded Salonika. They told lies, and then they used force to take over. The metaphor that I've seen in this country is that people have been telling lies, and they've been using, and I apologize, and people have been telling lies, and they've been using money to take control. And so it's left me with this dilemma because I go to bed at night watching these crazy occurrences, and it's scared the heck out of me. And I've attempted to make contacts with people, but everybody in the political system was busy doing their own thing. I had no influence. I didn't have a pulpit to stand from. But what I saw occurring in Greece with the takeover and living through, having lived with several families and made it after 600 days, bottom line is that my interest is how can we make a difference in seeing this progression that you've articulated and prevent it recurring.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you. Thanks for that. I'm gonna talk around it a little bit and then see if I can say something useful. The first way I want to talk around it is just to refer to something else which I've written, which I can't recite here, but I tried to crystallize the things that I think we have learned from the 1930s in Germany, but also the 1940s in Eastern Europe, and also the current return of authoritarianism into like a 2-page memo, which is called like 20 Lessons from the 20th Century or something like that, which you can find, like if you just look for it on that dreadful thing called the internet, you can find it. Which it's called the 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. And I can't, like, it's pretty good in going, like, distilling what I think we can do in just a few words. Which reminds me of the second thing, because like that started as a Facebook post. It's now been like published all over the place, but it started as a Facebook post. But it leads me to the second thing I wanted to say, which is, I really think you shouldn't watch stuff at night. You should read books. I mean, no, I'm perfectly serious about this. Like, I think the fact that we all stare at screens right before we go to bed tends to destroy our sense of, not yours personally, right? I mean, you obviously have a well-developed sense of time, but I think that like the way that we look at screens right up to the moment we go to bed is unhealthy, and then we should all charge like our gizmos in some other room and like read a book before bed. I just think that would be much healthier and helped us to have a sense of like that there is time.
Intellectually, I've known that.
Yeah, yeah, right. You're right. It's hard though, isn't it? I mean, it's just corporeally, it's neurologically, it's hard. Greece is really interesting. I hope you won't mind if I say some general things about the history of Greece, because it teaches us some things that help us see the argument and the moment. One of them has to do with anti-Semitism. right? So, I mean, anti-Semitism does, of course, matter in the Holocaust because it's so central to Hitler's own ideas. And it's also many people who are anti-Semites take part in killing Jews, and the people who are anti-Semites are at the forefront of killing Jews in 1941. It's very important, but it's not the whole explanation. A lot of what one sees in the Holocaust is that when institutions go away, certain kinds of ideas creep in, creep out. Things that didn't seem that important suddenly are important, and Greece is a good example. Nobody thinks there was that much anti-Semitism in Greece compared to other European countries in the 30s, right? Like compared to France, no. I mean, compared to compared to Poland or Romania, but nevertheless, when the Greek state goes away, which in effect it does, I mean, Greece is a strange sort of entity. It's totally dependent on Germany. There isn't enough food for a lot of the time. There's no foreign minister, right? It's not quite a state. During that moment, when the rule of law is open, then things that look anti-Semitic start happening, even if the people in question weren't necessarily anti-Semitic beforehand. Like, there's a wonderful article, I wish I could remember the colleague's name who wrote it, about the Jewish synagogue precisely in I think it was in Salonika, where people had kind of wanted that. It was a choice piece of property, and people have kind of wanted it for a long time.
Yeah,
But-
the university was built.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Exactly. Right. Right. So people had designs on that piece of land for a long time, but under the conditions of German occupation, and this goes to your point in the way about money, the Germans can sort of reach out to those people, and those people can say, yeah, let's file a petition about that land, right? And it's not exactly anti-Semitism, but it's very anti-Semitic in the outcome, right? The destruction. Oh, goodness. Well, that's another question. But the end of the normal regime of property rights, right, means that something like this can happen. And then once people get that land, then that you're not just getting land, you're partaking in a story of why it's okay to have that land. And then you have anti-Semitism afterwards, right? Because you have to tell some story about why that was a legitimate thing to be doing. So those are ways that, like, the history of Greece is actually really informative. That's the best I can do. Yeah. I mean, on what we can do, like, read the piece, but I think there's actually rather a lot we can do. I mean, I didn't want to make this like, this is about my book. I didn't want to make it like all political advocacy, but what I'm trying to set up here is the sense that we shouldn't be sliding from, oh, hey, we knew what was going to happen, to, hey, we know nothing. We know a lot, actually, and because we know a lot, there are a lot of specific steps we can take.
How would you articulate your objective? What would you like your book to succeed in?
For me, like, understanding and the production of time are very closely related. Understanding is an action which isn't fleeting, and it's not eternal, but it takes time, and then it's permanent once you've done it. So something like that. I think it's worthwhile trying to understand the Holocaust, not just because I think it's the most important event of the 20th century, in the West at least, on its own right, but also because if we can understand that, then we have a better chance of seeing history as going on, right? Something like that. If we can see history going on and understand the Holocaust, then we can really believe that history is going to go on. And we have to believe it's going to go on, or else we slide.
Address the human condition.
Excuse me?
It helps us address the human condition.
There's that. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, maybe this gentleman here.
Thanks. My name is Aaron, and I'm studying philosophy, specifically ethics, here at Brown. I'm a junior, and I'm a grandchildren of survivors. And my question is I love your framework, or at least these two warring conceptions of time and history, but my problem is that they, in their inevitability, they both obviate the discussion for the other. So if I believe in an arc of time, an arc of history that is inevitably going to go towards one way, that obviates the intellectual argument for a flat to an eternal conception of history, and vice versa. And so the problem with that, then, is that it doesn't, pardon my language, light a fire under our ass when there's a problem facing the world now, for instance, in Syria, like you said, or when you said in 1941 with Irena how already 2 million Polish Jews had died. Like, right now, there are 2 million Syrian people who have been displaced by the civil war. So it's happening now. And the problem is, if we these conceptions of time, how useful can they be if they're not compelling us to fight the terrors when we see them? That's my question.
Yeah, no, I want to be very clear. I'm against them both, you see? I'm against them both. I'm against them both. I see them both as traps. And I see.
What is trap? Oh, both.
Sorry, I see. Okay, Aaron's referring back to these two ideas of these two ways we experience time, right? The first I call the politics of inevitability. That is that we know roughly where things are going. We know not to use the word progress anymore because that's so 1950s, but we have a basic idea where things are going, right? So Fukuyama, 1990, end of history. It's all somehow going to work itself out as liberal democracy. That's what I'm calling the politics of inevitability, which is in opposition to, as you quite rightly say, a flat fascist time, right? A politics of eternity where nothing ever really happens. There's no goal. We shouldn't expect anything better, right? Nothing's ever going to really get better. It's unclear. It's always unclear what's happening. We don't really know. There's no truth. So let's just kind of hang out and let's click, right? Let's click. It's not, let's get fat. There's nothing we can really do. Life is one big, couch surfing party with the internet. And occasionally the leader, rises up and says something. You're absolutely right. Those things are against each other. I'm trying to oppose both of them, right? And it's not easy. And where I see is us sliding from one to the other. Like I see, maybe my images are wrong, but what I see is this vertical notion of time, the inevitability, now giving way, right? It's giving way. It's being crushed right now. But what's going to happen to it? We're going to end up here with this flat notion of time. And the one reason that I think this can happen is that, well, I see it happening. I mean, I see the philosophers, literally the fascist philosophers return, right? I mean, I have this professional deformation which says that everything that happens in the West first happens in the East, right? I mean, my colleagues who work on France think it's the other way around, right? But I think, so, when I see the return of fascist philosophy to Russia, and, starting in Poland now, when I see that happening, I think, okay, those are ideas which are coming this way. And in terms of voting patterns and in terms of things that leading politicians actually say, that seems to be happening. So my concern, I'm not going to try to, I'm not for this. I'm also not for this. I think they're both wrong, but also they're both, at the very least, authoritarian. Because the first says there's no particular reason to do anything because basically history sorts itself out. And the second says there's no particular reason to do anything because there's not really a future anyway, right? So one says the future, we know what the future is anyway, and the other says there's no future. And if you slip from one to the other, then there's no agency anywhere. I'm trying to oppose them both, and frankly, I don't think it's easy. I think there are a lot of ways in which people of good intentions are shifting from this to this. Like, for example, the argument, well, it's all liberalism's fault, therefore we should stop being liberals. That notion that like liberalism calls forth fascism and communism and all the bad things, therefore we should just all, we should feel very bad about ourselves. But feeling very bad about ourselves is not a historical posture, right? Or just flat out fascism, like the idea that history hasn't been interesting, it should start being interesting, like Steve Bannon says in his interview with The Hollywood Reporter, it's going to be fun again like the 1930s. Right, like that spirit, right? That like things should be. Yeah, that's what he said. Unfortunately, it's going to be fun again, like the 1930s. That notion that like everything's boring, let's make it exciting again, right? That's what people. That's what the fascists thought, right? I mean, admittedly, most of them were younger than 62 when they wrote that, or said it, right? And by the time they were 62, they had shares in American universities, and then they could disclaim it. But that's a fascist idea. This is all boring. Let's make it exciting again. Let's break some stuff, right? Or the word disruption, right? Everyone loves the word disruption. Let's disrupt for the sake of disruption. So I agree with you. I'm against both of them, right? Neither of them motivate us towards action. That's my point. And so I'm trying to make this case for history, which is an unintuitive one, counterintuitive one, because we usually think, okay, history, that means we're sitting in a couch reading a book, right? I'm trying to say that a sense of history gives us a sense of time, and a sense of time gives us a sense that we actually might be able to do something about the world, right? This is obviously not a revolutionary, like it's not a banner that I'm asking you to follow, right? But what I'm saying is we're at the risk of falling from one mistake into an even more dangerous mistake, and we have to catch ourselves somewhere, right? He had his hand up before.
My name is Selim. I'm a first-year PhD student at the Political Science Department. Firstly, Professor, thank you for a book that's not only good scholarship but also good prose. It was a very easy read, so thanks a lot for that. There was this paragraph in the last chapter that had me take a pause from reading, and I actually took a photo so that I don't lose the page. We find it easy to dismiss Nazi ideas without contemplating how they functioned. Our forgetfulness convinces us that we are different from Nazis by shrouding the ways we are the same. So before coming here, my background was in the think tank world. I was the bottom rung of the places I was working at, but some of the people I worked with, they were genuinely convinced evangelists of the liberal triumphalistic zeitgeist you were taking on in your speech. And many of them seemed genuinely distressed and at a loss as to how we came here. The big revelation for me in all of this, some of these pieces one could infer through reading other stuff, but this is paroxysmal. It comes in sudden bouts of hysteria of sorts. And once you realize that it's arrived, once you realize that you've forgotten how similar you are to Nazis and to those that proclaimed the end of history before them, it's kind of too late. So it seems like there is something we lose in translation, in progress, and it seems like we're entering a similar period once again. What's this malaise about our forgetfulness, and how do we fix that? What's the omega-3 solution for our longer-term memory? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit like the previous question in that, I mean, it would, if I were to give a clear, resounding answer, I would be disagreeing with my own argument, right? Yeah, I can give a two-finger answer. I can give a two cheers answer. Well, you want two of what? You want 2 seconds?
I'm
Okay.
not asking what the solution is necessarily,
Yeah.
but more,
Right.
why do we forget? Like, how do we come here? Is it just the way we are, or is
No.
there something about the way politics and our ideas about politics is structured?
No, okay, so that's a good question because you're forcing me. So I started this talk with a kind of intellectual history move, and I said there's this idea, they work against each other, they're both wrong. Let's try to have a different idea. And now you're asking, well, why do we even have, why do we do this and this? And that's a good question. It's a hard question, but I'll take a stab at it. It seems to me that we don't want to say that it's just the way we are. Because if we say because even if it is just the way we are, that would be such a horrifyingly, dreadful conclusion that we wouldn't really want to draw it. We should use our agency not to draw that conclusion. We don't want to say it's just the way we are. I mean, no historian will ever really say it's just the way we are, because every historian will say human nature is plastic, and so on and so forth. So what I would say is that the notions, the notion that I very quickly and roughly called the politics of inevitability actually has some pretty interesting material roots. So politics of inevitability can take over politics of eternity in a material situation where food leaves politics. Okay, so for the entire history of the entire world, I don't think I'm wrong about this, with the exception of about 60 years in the post-war West, food was always in politics. There was no politics without food. There was no food without politics. Politics was always, in that sense, Hitler and Lebensraum and all of that are normal. I mean, they're normal in the sense that he doesn't distinguish between nutrition and aggression. That's actually pretty much normal. We are your generation, my generation, the generation on top of me, and maybe half a generation more. Those are the only people in the history of the world who have ever had this notion that politics could be separated from food, right? And that really helps to think. That really helps you to think that then history could be coming to an end, because what would we be fighting about, right? When you're not on a day-to-day basis animated by, or as a government planner, we're not on a year-to-year or quarter-to-quarter or month-to-month basis animated by the question of how are we going to get enough calories, then the notion that it's all about ideas and that the better ideas are going to win, that kind of thinking becomes much more plausible, right? So now I'm making a historically contextualizing argument, right? Because I'm saying that we're in this very special bubble. Now that bubble, I think, is going to burst, right? I think that's part of our problem. And when I say we're more like the Nazis than we realize, like we have to be aware of the bubble we're in before we have a sense of how we react when it's going to burst. Then, like, as for the question of liberals and why they have to be so evangelist and why they always have to be wrong, I mean, I would say that, like, I would counsel against this notion that, like, so what's funny about fighting with Hegel, and I'm not the first person to say this, is whenever you fight with Hegel, like, he always comes back and, like, slaps you from behind. But like in my story, right? So Fukuyama says, Hegel, but then ironically, even as Fukuyama is saying Hegel says history is over, ironically at that very moment in Russia, another Hegelian is coming back, who says that history is over for a different reason. And in that very disagreement between two Hegelians, we see how history is not over, right? Because you have a disagreement of ideas between two Hegelians, et cetera, one of whom is very important in the American power structure, one of whom turns out to be very important in the Russian power structure. And so irony, 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 you can't ever get out of dialectics. I want to try to say, though, that liberalism, we can't just unfold the history of liberalism into this kind of dialectic where like liberals it seems like they're winning, you know, then they're blind, then they have to lose. I really hope we can avoid that. I admit it happened once. I admit that's happened once already, and that's a story that I'm telling. But I think that one can have a notion of liberalism where you say, we don't have to win. We can lose. We lose all the time. We've lost before. But nevertheless, we're real. You know, what worries me a little bit about liberals and their opponents sometimes is they say, well, once liberalism loses something, if liberalism has to win everything or it loses everything, right? I don't see why. Like, why can't liberalism like win a local election in South Dakota every now and again? You know, like why can't liberalism win some things but not everything? You know, and in a way, I think like that's a way of defining the stakes, because like if the stakes are all or nothing, then of course liberalism is going to lose, and that's why I think one has to drop the idea that it's all or nothing, because if you think it's all or nothing, then it is all or nothing, right? I don't think it is. I mean, I think liberalism is kind of one. It's like, I mean, I'm really a cognitive pluralist. I think there are plenty of other ideas out there which have their own logics and power, and liberalism is out there with them, you know. And liberalism has this funny one part of liberalism's inherent, you know, one of its predispositions is to say it's all or nothing, right? Since we're universalists, we have to win completely or we have to lose completely, and I'm afraid that that's part of, you know, why liberals tend to go from here to here, right? So I'm trying to answer your question. I'm just trying to say we don't have to. We can fall halfway down the ladder, you know, and then grab onto like a window ledge, and then say, oh look, there's a flower here, you know, and then kind of smell it for a while, and then get a better sense of the moment, take a deep breath, you know. We need to do that. Window ledges, flowers, deep breaths. We need that. Yes, sir.
Is it on? Yeah. My name's Roger Zentner. I'm a retired lawyer living here in Providence. Your description of the regularities of the politics of eternity kind of struck home with me, because the first time I heard Donald Trump refer to "let's make America great again," I looked at my wife and I said, what in the hell is this guy talking about? It's a fantasy. And the thing about it, however, is, the thing that I have despair about, is that there's about 60 million people in this country who believe in that fantasy, who believe in that articulation of a regularity that really, as far as I'm concerned, doesn't exist. And I just am concerned that with Hitler, it took a terrible world war to correct his conception, his regularities, and his conceptions, fantastical conceptions. And I'm not giving up, but I guess I do have some despair in the situation this country finds itself in. I guess it's not a question.
No, it's okay. I'm going to do the same thing I did in the talk, which is I'm going to make it worse, and then I'll try to make it maybe a little better at the end. I mean, so, like, American political culture is not, like, that's not my area of expertise. It does strike me, though, that the people who voted for Trump, I share your anxiety, right? I mean, of course I share anxiety, because I had this notion of regularities, and I was arguing about this and talking about the return of flat fascist time and all this sort of thing before the Trump phenomena came on the scene. And in my way of seeing the world, which might be right or might be wrong, this is something which is, the West really is a kind of entity, you know, and this is something which started in Russia and has sort of been spreading. And then, like, there are various ways that Russia and America cross-pollinate all the time. And right now they're doing more of the pollination, and we're doing more of the flowering. But I think it's like this. We're really in one, like, this is one historical loop between Russia and America, like, and including Ukraine and Europe. I mean, this is anyway. This is the book that I'm trying to write now. I see it as sort of one story, you know, which is a way, like, slightly going back to your question and your question, like. It's a way that I'm not an American exceptionalist. Like American exceptionalism for me is another word for complacency. Like, you think you're an exception, therefore you don't have to think, right? So we're so slow of foot when things like the Ukrainian. I mean, it's going to be a painful comparison, I hope, but the Ukrainians were so much faster in 2014 to react to the same stuff that we got in 2016, right? I mean, the Russians did the same cyber war against Ukraine they did against us. And the Ukrainians were much faster in reacting to it. And they were also much more skeptical, more quickly about this thing called fake news than we are. I mean, it's a big generalization, but I was in both places, and like it's kind of my very strong sense. Like we're reacting to the same stuff. We kind of limp along. We're not sure. Who knows? Oh yeah, somebody just got elected. Okay, but now I promised you I was going to try to make it better. So there are some other, I mean, I'm worried about this. There are some other reasons why people vote for Trump. You know, there's some reasons which I think on the East Coast are often not clear. Like one phenomenon I think we have to keep in mind is all the folks who voted for Obama and then voted for Trump, right? Like if you take them out, he loses the election. Like in Ohio, if he doesn't get the people, he gets a lot of people who voted for Obama, right? And so then we have to think a little bit about our identitarian stuff. We have to think a little bit about, you know, whether it really is all about racism, you know, which I think is a shortcut we too often use. And I think that there are things that are simpler, like people are really getting hit by globalization. And here's a guy who has a story about globalization. We don't like the story, right? But there's also the fact that they really are getting hit by the globalization. And it really is happening. There really are class interests involved. And, you know, rightly or wrongly, I mean, of course, I think wrongly, but rightly or wrongly, people were seeing him as being somehow on their side, right? And then that then invites them into the story, and that's where things get dangerous. The reason, you know, the reason why I have some amount of hope is that I think that we can actually process the 20th century. So, for example, if I say Reichstag fire, I'm now going back to your question, sir. Reichstag fire, we should immediately have the reflex that if there's a terrorist incident in some sensitive spot of the United States a couple of months into the Trump administration, we shouldn't all jump up and down and scream about how we need to have Parliament suspended and a state of emergency and so on, right? We should know that like that's the oldest trick in the Hitlerian book. We should know that that is the state of emergency declared in Germany after the Reichstag fire lasted throughout, you know, all the way to 1945, right, as you say. We can recognize these things. And there aren't actually that many new things in the Eternity playbook, right? Reichstag fire is pretty big. So there are things that we can look out for, like they're actually, this is why I devote so much energy in the talk to, let's remember that there is a historical moment, because in that moment there are these patterns and these examples that we can maybe pull out. When the Reichstag fire happened to the Germans, they weren't really ready for it. There's no reason why we shouldn't be ready for the Reichstag fire. I mean, not the actual Reichstag, right? The actual Reichstag is fine. Like I've seen their fire alarms. They have really good fire alarms. It's not called the Reichstag anymore either, but you know, you get the point. But if something blows up in the United States, God forbid, you know, that we should not immediately think, oh yes, this means there must be a state of emergency. You know, that we should be ready. We should be ready. I mean, we should also, you know, we don't know who set the Reichstag fire, right? You know, there's a revisionist literature about this now, which says that maybe it actually was the German state. I'll just leave you with that thought. Let's see. There was this gentleman, and then.
Yeah, I guess two things. One of which the idea of, you mentioned, you know, about this discontinuity. I think it was someone, a police officer or so, and there was a communist, and there was the Nazis and so on. And I was wondering, with the authoritarian personality, to a certain extent, there might have been continuity in the sense that there were always people who are opportunists, who have their finger to the wind, and if there's some new people come into power, they'll identify with them and do whatever they can to not identify with whoever's on the receiving end. And so when there's a change, they go along with that change. So, you know, so the idea is that there's an authoritarian that goes with whoever the powers may be. And when those in power change, their allegiances change. But their compass remains the same. Mm-hmm. The other thing is Hannah Arendt, two things, one of which about the vulnerability of historical truth, and the other thing about the idea of that colonialism as a precursor to fascism. You know, I think of these maps of, you know, 1920s Europe and so forth, and, you know, the entire globe is under colonial domination. Mm-hmm. There's no place else to go to. You know, you think of Eichmann and Madagascar. And the idea of the United States as a model of, you know, eliminating the indigenous population and seeing that as a potential model of what Hitler might have wanted to do in Russia. And last but not least, I mean, the idea of the state. And here's where I'm trying to tease out, because it seems makes so much sense what you're saying, but at the same time, I wanted to push back. I mean, to a certain extent, you know, the repressive apparatus of the state is the SS. You know, the idea of using that force. So it wasn't at least that facet of the state that Hobbes would say conceivably might have been the most essential. A monopoly of force might have been an essential element, and to that extent it wasn't statelessness, even though it is, but there was elements of state, you know, that were. And last but not least, France, Britain, and so forth. If it's not 1648 Westphalia, Western nation-state system as the model of the state, that they're not really states or haven't been in the past. It was empire and then integration. What is a state? And what kind of historical instance would you provide us for an idea of a stable state as an alternative to this horrible Holocaust?
Okay. You started off so modestly. I'll take him in reverse. So I'm not trying to claim that there's never been a state, right, or that Britain and France weren't states. What I'm trying to say is that the notion of a nation state, like a territorially bounded hexagon, you know, in the case of France, that never really happened, or when it did happen, it tended to be a disaster. So I'm willing to accept that there was a Serbian nation state. The Serbian nation state, in my view, is the progenitor of all the rest of them, and the Serbian nation state, you know, led us to the First World War. With France and Britain, they exist as empires, right? I mean, this way, like, I'm really with the kind of the transnational, you know, post-colonial people on this particular point. It's just that I include Europe, and like, usually people mark off Europe and they say this is the zone where people colonize, and they mark off the rest and say this is the zone where people get colonized. I buy the whole post-colonial thing. I just think it has to be consistent, and we don't put the white people here and the brown people here. It's all one process, and people colonize other people regardless of what we see as race all the time, right? And so, which brings me to your Hannah Arendt point. Of course, this is absolutely right. I mean, Hannah Arendt made this argument on the strength of cigarette smoke and reading Joseph Conrad, right? But I think she was fundamentally correct. You know, the intuition that you have to begin from a boyhood like Hitler's, where the world really was covered in empire, you know, where the space for Germany to have, you know, just a place in the sun is running out, and that Hitler concludes that the only place what one has to do is precisely apply the logic of empire to Europe itself. You know, so it's not that he's, you know, perfectly consistent, but he sometimes talks about Ukraine as India, sometimes as Africa, sometimes as the American West, but in every single case, it's always some kind of imperial referent. And it follows from this that there aren't really states there. Those aren't really states. They might look like states. So he takes the same attitude towards the Soviet Union and Poland that European colonizers did towards the political entities that they encountered in other parts of the world. These aren't really states. These aren't really people. They don't really have rights. And that's the logic of the destruction of the indigenous political order, you know, whatever it might be. International law applies to us. It doesn't apply to internationally, it applies to us, right? And so the sort of the dirty little secret of the way the European Union works is that the people who had been saying that the international law only applied to us ended up only having Europe. And then international law applied to them, right? And they've applied it very well to themselves. So France exists as a state, Britain exists as a state. My intuition, my strong one, is that the nation state or whatever is necessary but not sufficient. That it has to have some, so people who think the European Union could exist without, you know, some kind of lower level entities, I think are mistaken. But I think also people who think that whatever, you know, Montenegro or Macedonia or even Britain are going to survive without some higher level of politics, I think that's also a mistake. I think you have to have both things at the same time. On truth, right? This is very close to home. I mean, let me try to answer it in a vocational way. Like there are professions where truth is very important. Journalism, history. I mean, we all just have to look around to see what's happening to journalism. Journalism is under huge threat. I mean, financial, but also ideological, right? I mean, the notion that there isn't really any truth is one that's been shoved down the throat of the profession, and now we're seeing, interestingly, if you look at the headlines of the New York Times and the Washington Post, like just like in the last few weeks, they've taken some kind of a turn, right? I mean, the Washington Post headline, which says I'm paraphrasing, Trump says baselessly, right? The word baseless in a headline, that's new for American journalism, right? They're moving out of the on the one hand, on the other hand, I read it on the internet as opposed to I read it in the encyclopedia. They're moving away from that, which is interesting. Because but I'm not going to define truth for you here, but I think truth as a vocational goal is obviously very important to professions like journalism and history. And those are both professions which, like in my scheme here, are professions that help us to buy time. Opportunism as historical, I mean, I'm willing to accept that people are generally opportunistic, or that some people are, or maybe even that there's some such thing as authoritarian personality. But what I mean is that once we get down to that level, then we no longer have then there's no longer a historical story, right? Then we're precisely moving towards eternity. Because what you're really saying is, like, people are this way. Okay, they're this way, but then we don't have history, right? Then we don't have history anymore. If you can create a situation where your description is the right one, then that's my description of how the Holocaust happened in large measure. That we get people to that point where the only thing that matters is that. Because that's historically, right, that's historically contingent. We could be in a world like the world we're in now, where the law counts and where lots of other things count, or we could be in a world where only our opportunism counts. And then when we're in that world, which is the world of, let's say, Latvia in 1943, we're in that world, we all behave very, very, very differently, right? So I would just historicize your point and say, yeah, that might be a description, but it's a description of a certain kind of world. And then those people do things, and this is what's so important, then those people do things that they never would have done otherwise, right?
We are well out of time, but we should continue the conversation over drinks and book signing.